a crossroads town in the Ardennes, December 26, 1944. The light is already failing by mid-afternoon, the way it does in a Belgian winter, and the snow across the low hills south of Bastogne has been churned grey by tracks and shellfire. A single Sherman tank noses along a sunken road toward a cluster of foxholes. The men in those holes have not been relieved in days. They are paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division, and for most of a week they have been surrounded, low on ammunition, low on food, tending wounded in a barracks because there is nowhere safer to put them. The tank stops, a hatch opens, and a lieutenant named Charles Boggis calls out to the dug-in men, telling them these are friendly tanks, asking them to come forward. For a long moment, nothing happens. The paratroopers stay in their holes. They have learned in this campaign that the thing coming toward you through the trees is usually trying to kill you. Then an officer of the airborne engineers walks over and makes contact with the tankers. The ring around Bastogne has been broken. That is the story as it is usually told. A daring armoured dash, a dramatic meeting in the snow, a besieged garrison saved at the last possible moment by George Patton's tanks racing to the rescue. It is one of the most famous episodes of the entire war in Europe, and almost everyone who tells it gets the meaning of it wrong. Because here is the strange thing. The men who were supposedly rescued did not think they had been rescued. Many of them were insulted by the idea. Their acting commander would later push back at the very word. The paratroopers had held. They intended to keep holding. When reporters and later filmmakers turned the link-up into a rescue, the veterans of the 101st bristled at it for the rest of their lives. Their attitude, expressed in many forms over many years, amounted to a simple question: who said we needed to be rescued? So we are left with a contradiction, a relief operation that the relieved refused to call a relief, a rescue that the rescued rejected, and that contradiction is the doorway into a much larger and much stranger story than the meeting in the snow suggests. Because the real question of Bastogne is not how Patton's tanks broke in, it is why the Germans, who had the town completely surrounded, who outnumbered the defenders, who held every advantage of position and initiative, were never able to break it themselves. The answer to that question has almost nothing to do with the heroism we usually celebrate. It has to do with roads, with fuel, with the geometry of a battlefield, and the mathematics of who could bring force to bear, and where, and how fast. It has to do with decisions made in a schoolhouse in France days before the relief tanks moved, and with a way of fighting that had been quietly assembled over years, largely out of sight. To understand why the ring broke, you have to stop looking at the tank in the snow and start looking at the thing almost no one photographs: the empty roads behind it. Let me take you back to how the town came to be surrounded in the first place, because the encirclement itself is where the puzzle begins. On December 16, 1944, the German army launched the largest offensive it would ever mount on the Western Front. 3 armies struck through the Ardennes forest along a front of roughly 80 miles, in weather so poor that the overwhelming Allied advantage in air power was, for the moment, grounded and useless. The Germans called it the Watch on the Rhine. History would call it the Battle of the Bulge. For the Great Bulge, the attack punched into the American line. The goal was ambitious to the point of fantasy: cross the Meuse River, drive on to the port of Antwerp, split the British and American armies, and force the Western Allies toward a separate peace. The plan depended on speed. Everything depended on speed. And speed, in the Ardennes in winter, depended on roads. The Ardennes is not open country. It is a tangle of forested hills, deep river valleys, and narrow ridgelines, cut by a small number of hard surface roads that thread through the villages and river crossings. An army moving tanks and trucks and fuel and ammunition through that terrain cannot simply spread out and roll forward. It is channeled. It must follow the roads. And that is what made a small, unremarkable Belgian market town suddenly one of the most important pieces of ground in Europe. Bastogne sat at the junction of 7 paved roads. 7. They converged on the town from every direction like spokes meeting a hub. For the German armoured columns driving west toward the Meuse, particularly those of the 5th Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel, control of that road network was not a luxury. It was a necessity. Whoever held Bastogne controlled the movement of armies through the southern shoulder of the offensive. The Germans understood this perfectly. So did the Americans eventually. The race to Bastogne was a race to seize the hub before the other side could lock it shut. It is worth pausing on just how much weight rested on this one small town, because the point is easy to state and hard to feel. Bastogne itself was of no great value. It was a market town of a few thousand people, with a church, a square, and a scatter of stone buildings. No one was fighting for the town. They were fighting for the 7 roads that met inside it. Take away those roads, and Bastogne would have merited nothing more than a line on a map. Because of them, it became a cork in a bottle. A single force holding the junction could disrupt the movement of an entire army across a wide stretch of front, forcing the attacker onto longer, worse, more crowded routes around the obstacle, and slowing everything he tried to do. In a campaign whose only real enemy was the clock, that slowing was worth more than any number of casualties inflicted. This is the first thing to understand about the whole battle. The prize was never the buildings. It was the ability to move, and the ability to deny movement to the other side. The Germans very nearly won that race. In the opening days, the American units in the path of the offensive were shattered or overrun. The 28th Infantry Division, strung out along the river frontier, was hit by forces many times its strength and broke apart into isolated pockets, each fighting its own desperate small battle. And yet, in breaking, it did something the Germans had not fully reckoned with. It made them pay for time. Roadblocks manned by a handful of men and a single gun forced German columns to stop, deploy, and fight, and each of those halts cost the attackers an hour here and 2 hours there, hours the German timetable could not spare. Further east, a combat command of the 9th Armoured Division and other scratch forces threw themselves across the approach roads and were largely destroyed doing it. But their destruction was not wasted. Every hour they delayed the German spearheads was an hour bought for the defense of the town behind them. This is a pattern worth marking early, because it runs through the entire battle. Again and again, the decisive currency at Bastogne was not ground. It was time. What ultimately saved the town was a decision made far to the rear, in the early hours, to commit the strategic reserve. The 18th Airborne Corps, which included the 82nd and the 101st Airborne Divisions, was resting and refitting in France after the brutal autumn fighting in the Netherlands. The 101st was ordered to Bastogne. The men were trucked north through the night in open transports, in bitter cold, many of them short of ammunition, short of winter clothing, some without helmets or overcoats, scavenging equipment as they went, riding toward a battle whose shape no one yet understood. They were not alone, and the units that reached the approaches ahead of them may have mattered even more in those first hours. Sent up from Patton's 3rd Army to the south was Combat Command B of the 10th Armoured Division, under Colonel William Roberts. Roberts split his force into 3 teams, named in the American fashion for their commanders, and pushed them out along the threatened roads to meet the German spearheads head-on. This decision to divide the command was later questioned by textbook doctrine, which frowned on splitting armor into small packets. But Roberts understood the geometry. There were 3 main approaches to defend, and one massed fist could hold only one of them, so he made 3 fists and sent them to the 3 doors. To the east, along the road from Longvilly, went Team Cherry, under Lieutenant Colonel Henry Cherry. To the north, to the village of Noville, went Team Desaubry, under Major William Desaubry. To the southeast, toward Marvey and Warden, went Team O'Hara, under Lieutenant Colonel James O'Hara. Their orders were the same everywhere. Hold, buy time, trade ground and lives for the hours the paratroopers needed to dig in around the town itself. The fight at Noville has become, for those who study the battle closely, the clearest example of what those hours cost and what they were worth. Major Desaubry was young, in his mid-20s, holding an exposed village north of Bastogne against the oncoming 2nd Panzer Division, one of the strongest German formations in the offensive. He had a few hundred men and a modest force of tanks. Against him came a full panzer division, whose orders, crucially, were to bypass Bastogne and race for the Meuse. On the morning of December 19, in thick fog, German armor engaged the village at close range, and a savage, confused fight developed as the mist repeatedly closed and thinned across the battlefield. Much of the fighting took place at short distances, because the fog limited how far either side could see. Desaubry's men were reinforced by a battalion of paratroopers from the arriving airborne division and by the guns of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, whose crews proved deadly against German armor in the days that followed. Together they held Noville far longer than anyone had a right to expect, knocking out a substantial number of German tanks and throwing the 2nd Panzer Division's timetable into disarray. Desaubry himself was badly wounded and later captured when the aid station he was evacuated to was overrun. The survivors of the Noville fight withdrew south to the village of Foy and then into the perimeter, having bled a panzer division for 2 crucial days. The 2nd Panzer Division, delayed and diverted, would drive on west toward the Meuse. Its fate is worth following, because it becomes the whole offensive in miniature. The division's spearhead pushed to within a few miles of the river, closer to the Meuse than any other German unit would get. And there, near the village of Selles, it halted, its leading elements low on fuel and waiting for gasoline that never adequately arrived. Stalled in the open, it was pinned by American armor driving in from the west and pounded from the air once the skies had cleared, and in the last days of December it was surrounded and largely destroyed. The strongest armored division on that axis died within sight of its objective, not beaten in a straight fight so much as stranded, out of gas, at the end of a supply line that could not feed it. What happened to the 2nd Panzer at Selles was what the fuel shortage did to the entire attack, only concentrated into one place and one division. An army that had gambled everything on speed had run out of the one thing that made speed possible. To the east, Team Cherry met a similar fate, and served a similar purpose along the road running through Longvilly and Nef toward Bastogne. There the confusion of the first days reached its peak, the road east of the town filled with a great jam of American vehicles falling back from the collapsing frontier, and into this tangle drove the leading German armor, and the two collided in a chaotic, destructive fight strung out along the highway. Team Cherry was broken up in the fighting, its commander's forward elements cut off and largely destroyed, but the wreckage and the resistance choked the eastern road at exactly the moment the Germans most needed it clear. Lieutenant Colonel Cherry was forced back from his command post as German forces overran his positions, and his team was driven from the ground it had been holding. Historians describe him as continuing to report and to fight, even as he was pushed back, rather than pulling out voluntarily. That was the essence of what those teams were asked to do, not to win, but to be there, in the road, slowing the enemy down for as long as they could hold. Team O'Hara, to the southeast, anchored its corner of the developing perimeter through hard fighting around Marvy and the high ground nearby, holding the southeastern door, while the others held the north and the east. In every case the pattern was the same. Small armored teams, thrown across the roads, fought, bled, and fell back, and in doing so, denied the Germans the one thing the whole offensive was built to preserve: speed. By around December 21, the delaying actions had done their work and reached their limit. The teams and the paratroopers pulled back into a rough circle around Bastogne, and the Germans, working around both flanks, closed the roads behind them. The encirclement was complete. The forces surrounding Bastogne belonged principally to the 47th Panzer Corps under General Heinrich von Luttwitz. They included the 2nd Panzer Division, the Panzer Lehr Division under Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein, the 26th Volksgrenadier Division under General Heinz Kokott, and elements of the 5th Fallschirmjäger Division, a German parachute division, operating on the southern approaches. On paper, this was a powerful ring: armor, infantry and artillery, encircling a lightly equipped airborne division and its attachments. Inside that ring, the defense settled into a rough wheel of sectors held by the airborne regiments. The 501st and the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiments, the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, and the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, together with the armored teams and tank destroyers and the divisional artillery, each held a slice of the perimeter, tied together by field telephone and radio and by the short interior distances across the town. And in overall command, with the division's commander, Major General Maxwell Taylor, away in the United States, was the division's artillery commander, Brigadier General Antony McAuliffe. That McAuliffe was an artilleryman by profession is a detail worth holding on to, because artillery would prove to be the hinge on which the entire defense turned. Here the first piece of the real puzzle appears, because von Lüttwitz did not throw his entire corps at the town in one overwhelming blow. He could not, and under his orders he was not supposed to. The instructions from above prioritized the drive to the Meuse. The 2nd Panzer Division and much of Panzer Lehr were meant to bypass Bastogne, to leave a force to contain it, and to keep racing west before the Americans could recover and before the weather cleared. Bastogne was to be masked and contained, not necessarily stormed at any cost. The main effort lay to the west, at the river. This was not stupidity, it was doctrine, and under the German plan it was arguably correct. The entire offensive was a gamble against time. Every hour spent grinding down a surrounded garrison was an hour the spearheads were not crossing the Meuse. So the Germans made a defensible choice: contain Bastogne with part of the force, push the rest onward, and reduce the town later. The trouble was that the town would not cooperate, and the roads the Germans needed ran straight through it. On December 22, the Germans decided to try a shortcut. They would ask the defenders to quit. 4 German soldiers, 2 officers, and 2 enlisted men, one of them carrying a white flag, walked up a road into the American lines southeast of Bastogne, near the sector held by the glider infantry. They carried a typed message, in English and in German, addressed to the commander of the encircled town. The message was, in tone, almost courteous. It described what it called the hopeless military situation of the surrounded American forces. It offered an honorable surrender to avoid, in its words, total annihilation, and it demanded a response within 2 hours, warning of annihilation by the massed German artillery that would follow a refusal. The message made its way up the chain to McAuliffe. Accounts of the moment differ in small details, as these things always do, but the substance is well documented and confirmed by participants on both sides. McAuliffe, on being told that the Germans were demanding his surrender, responded at first with a single word of disbelief and dismissal. That word was nuts. Then came the problem of how to answer formally. His staff suggested he simply put his first reaction on paper, and he did. The typed reply that went back to the German lines read, to the German commander, nuts, the American commander. When the German officers received it, they were baffled. It was not a word that translated. The American officer delivering it, Colonel Joseph Harper, was asked what it meant, whether it was affirmative or negative. Harper told them, in effect, that it was decidedly not affirmative, and that in plain terms it meant, go to hell. He added a warning that the Americans would destroy every German who tried to take the town. Then, with heavy irony, given the circumstances, he wished them a Merry Christmas. The exchange became legend almost immediately, and it is one of the rare legends of the war that is essentially true, but we should be careful about what it actually tells us. It is often presented as the moment American grit turned the battle. It did not. Defiance did not stop German shells or German tanks. The refusal to surrender is a magnificent story, but by itself it explains nothing about why Bastogne held. To find that, we have to keep looking past the drama, because the Germans, having been told no, now had to make good on their threat, and they could not. If stories like this one hold your attention, the forgotten mechanics behind the famous moments, then consider subscribing and leaving a like. It genuinely helps this kind of detailed history reach the people who want it. Let us take the German army in the Ardennes seriously, because it is easy, knowing how the war ended, to underestimate what was arrayed around that town. This was not a broken force going through the motions. The German soldier of late 1944 remained man for man, among the most tactically capable in the world. German small unit leadership was superb. Their doctrine of mission command, of telling subordinate commanders what to achieve and trusting them to work out how, produced initiative and aggression at every level. Their armor was formidable. The Panther and the heavier tanks outclassed the American Sherman in a straight gun duel at range. Their veterans had years of hard experience on multiple fronts. Field Marshal Walter Model, who oversaw the offensive, and von Manteuffel, who commanded the 5th Panzer Army, were among the most respected practitioners of mobile warfare alive. And in the opening days, all of that showed. The offensive tore a hole in the American line that genuinely alarmed the Allied High Command. Whole American units ceased to exist. The Germans achieved near total surprise, in part because Allied intelligence had convinced itself that the enemy was incapable of a major attack, and in part because the winter weather masked the build-up from the air. For a few days, the Germans fought exactly the war they wanted to fight: fast, aggressive, and largely unseen. So when we ask why they failed at Bastogne, we are not asking why a weak army lost. We are asking why a strong one, holding the outer ring, could not close its fist. And the answer begins with the thing that made the whole offensive possible and doomed it at the same time: fuel. The German plan was built on a resource the German army did not actually possess in sufficient quantity: gasoline. The offensive had been stockpiling fuel for weeks, and it was still not enough for the distances involved. Worse, the plan openly counted on capturing American fuel dumps intact along the way to keep the tanks rolling. That is an extraordinary thing to build a war-winning offensive around. The assumption that you will refuel from your enemy's supplies because you cannot carry enough of your own. When those captured dumps did not materialize as hoped, and when the muddy, icy, congested roads devoured fuel at ruinous rates, German columns began, quite literally, to run dry. Tanks were abandoned, not because they were knocked out, but because they were empty. An army that cannot move, cannot encircle, cannot mass, cannot exploit. The lifeblood of the attack was leaking away from the first days. Now hold that image, German armor immobilized for lack of fuel, and place it against the geometry of Bastogne. The Germans needed those 7 roads. They could not get their heaviest formations onto them, because the town sat astride the junction and the town would not fall. So the powerful armored divisions that might have crushed the perimeter were instead committed to the drive west, toward the Meuse, on the roads that ran around the town rather than through it, and even there they were stalling for fuel. What remained to actually reduce Bastogne was a patchwork. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division, capable but not a first-line armored formation, reinforced piecemeal by whatever could be spared. A regiment of Panzer Lehr here, a battle group there. Later, the German High Command, increasingly fixated on the town it had failed to take, would begin feeding still more units toward Bastogne, including an elite mechanized brigade, but always in additions and increments rather than in one decisive mass. There is a bitter irony folded into this, and it deepened as the days passed. In the beginning, the German plan sensibly treated Bastogne as a secondary objective, something to be masked and bypassed so the armor could get onto the Meuse. But as the main offensive stalled short of the river, and as it became clear that the great drive to the coast was not going to succeed, the German High Command grew steadily more fixated on the town it had failed to take. What had begun as a road hub to be brushed aside became, over the last week of December, an obsession, a symbol of the offensive's frustration. More and more force was ordered against it, drawn away from other tasks, precisely at the point when the strategic reason for wanting it had already evaporated. By early January, the Germans were pouring strength into an attempt to capture a town whose original purpose, opening the roads west, no longer mattered, because there was no longer going to be a drive west. They were spending their last reserves to take a prize that had already lost its value. This is what a failing plan does. It keeps demanding sacrifices in the name of an objective that has quietly become meaningless. Because admitting the objective is meaningless means admitting the whole enterprise has failed. And this produced the single most important German failure of the entire siege. Not a lack of courage, not a lack of skill, a lack of concentration. The German attacks on Bastogne came in piecemeal, from different directions, at different times, by different units that were not fighting as one coordinated whole. A push from the east one day, a probe from the northwest the next. The defenders, holding the inside of the ring, could shift their reserves to meet each threat in turn because they were operating on interior lines, the short paths across the middle of the circle. The attackers, spread around the outside of a wide perimeter, could not easily concentrate against a single point without exposing themselves elsewhere, and lacked the fuel and the coordination to do it well. To grasp why the interior lines mattered so much, picture the defense not as a wall, but as a hub with its own spokes. The town sat in the middle. The artillery battalions were positioned near the center, where they could reach in any direction. Because the perimeter was small, and because the guns were centrally placed, the defenders could bring the fire of many batteries to bear on any single threatened point in a matter of minutes, no matter which side of the circle it appeared on. A German attack coming in from the northwest could be met not only by the infantry in that sector, but by the concentrated fire of guns that a moment before had been ready to support the opposite side of the town. This is the quiet mechanism that broke the Christmas assault and every serious German push. Not the rifle in the foxhole alone, but the ability to make the weight of the entire defense fall on one place at one time. The Germans, spread thin around the outside of the circle, had no comparable ability. Their guns supported their own sectors. To concentrate the fire of the whole ring on a single point would have required a level of coordination across separate divisions that their fragmented, fuel-starved, piecemeal deployment simply did not allow. So the defenders, though fewer, could always be locally stronger at the decisive point, because they could gather their strength faster than the attackers could gather theirs. A smaller force that can concentrate beats a larger force that cannot. That sentence is close to the whole secret of the siege. This is the deep structure of the siege, and it is almost never explained. The Germans surrounded Bastogne, but surrounding a place and taking it are not the same act. To take it, they needed to mass overwhelming force at one point and break through. Everything about their situation, the fuel shortage, the competing priority of the Meuse, the road geometry that pulled their armor away, the sheer difficulty of coordinating separate divisions around a wide circle in winter, conspired against that concentration. They were strong everywhere and decisive nowhere. Meanwhile, inside the ring, the defenders were fighting a different and quieter war against shortage, and their most desperate shortage was not of courage, but of the two things that keep an encircled force alive: ammunition and medical care. The medical crisis had struck early and hard. In the confused first days, before the perimeter had firmed up, the division's main medical company, its surgical heart, was caught by a German thrust west of the town and overrun. In a single stroke, the garrison lost most of its surgeons, much of its medical equipment, and a large number of medical personnel taken prisoner. This was a catastrophe hiding inside the larger battle. It meant that as the wounded began to accumulate, and they accumulated quickly, there were almost no surgeons left inside the perimeter to treat them. The wounded were gathered in a Belgian army barracks in the town, in cold and crowded conditions, with dwindling supplies of plasma, bandages, and anesthetic. Men with abdominal wounds and chest wounds, the kind that demand surgery within hours, could often only be kept as comfortable as possible, and some of them died who might have lived with a fully equipped operating table and a trained surgeon on hand. The aid men, and the few remaining medical officers, did extraordinary work with almost nothing, but the arithmetic was brutal. A surrounded town cannot evacuate its wounded, and this one could barely treat them. The ammunition situation was nearly as grave, and it struck at the very thing the defense depended on most: the artillery. Bastogne was being held, more than by anything else, by the coordinated fire of its guns. But guns are only as useful as the shells they can fire, and the shells were running out. At the worst point, the gunners were placed under strict rationing, ordered to fire only on clearly identified, worthwhile targets, and in some batteries, the number of rounds a gun could fire in a day was cut to a mere handful. Battery commanders had to husband their shells like misers, holding fire against tempting targets, in order to keep enough in reserve for the moment a real German assault came in. The defense was, quite literally, running out of the ability to defend itself. And over all of it lay the cold. The winter of 1944 to 1945 was one of the coldest in memory in that part of Europe. Men in inadequate clothing, many of whom had ridden to the battle without proper winter gear, lived in open foxholes in freezing temperatures, in snow, with feet perpetually wet. Frostbite and trenchfoot took a steady toll that never appears in the dramatic accounts, but filled the aid stations alongside the battle wounds. The non-battle casualties, the men crippled by cold rather than by shot and shell, were a constant, grinding drain on the garrison's strength. So by the days before Christmas, the picture inside Bastogne was of a force that was holding, but only just, and that was quietly running down. Not enough shells, almost no surgeons, wounded dying on straw, men freezing in their holes. The German ring could not close, but time was on the side of the ring, because every day the defenders grew a little weaker. Something had to change, and on December 23, the sky changed. For a week, low cloud and fog had grounded the Allied air forces and hidden the German movements. Then a high-pressure system moved in from the east, the kind of clear, brutally cold weather that the men in the foxholes would remember with hatred for its cold and with gratitude for its skies. And into those newly opened skies came the thing the Germans feared most: Allied air power. The relief of the garrison's supply crisis began not with tanks, but with parachutes. First came the Pathfinders. A small team of specialists parachuted into the perimeter to set up radio and radar navigation beacons that would guide the incoming transports precisely onto the drop zones. Then, on December 23, the transport aircraft arrived, C-47s of the Troop Carrier Command, flying low over the town to drop bundles of supplies by parachute to the men below. Over the following days, hundreds of aircraft delivered ammunition, medical supplies, rations, and other critical stores into the perimeter. The airdrops did not make the defenders comfortable, but they refilled the artillery, at least in part, and they let the guns fire again when the guns were needed most. There was even relief for the medical crisis, delivered from the air in the most dramatic way. Volunteer surgical teams were flown in by glider, gliders towed behind transport aircraft and released to land inside the shrinking perimeter, so that trained surgeons could at last operate on the men who had been dying for want of them. It was an extraordinary thing, to reinforce a surrounded town not only with bullets, but with surgeons descending out of the sky in fragile plywood aircraft. The transport crews and the glider pilots paid for these missions. German anti-aircraft fire around the perimeter was heavy, and aircraft were shot down and gliders destroyed delivering their loads. But the deliveries got through in enough quantity to matter. At the same time, fighter bombers ranged over the German forces around the town and along the roads leading to it, attacking columns, vehicles, and gun positions. The very concentration and movement that the Germans needed in order to storm Bastogne now exposed them to attack from above the moment they attempted it. An army trying to mass for an assault is a target. The clear skies turned German strength into German vulnerability in a single stroke. The Germans knew the window was closing. The weather would not stay clear forever. The American relief force was known to be driving up from the south, and the whole offensive was stalling short of the Meuse. So the German command decided to make its maximum effort against the town while it still could. That effort came on Christmas Day. The attack was planned by General Kokot, whose 26th Volksgrenadier Division had borne much of the containment of Bastogne, reinforced now with armor and fresh grenadiers. Kokot studied the perimeter and chose to strike where he judged the defense thinnest, against the northwestern face, near the villages of Champs and Hemroul, on a sector held by the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment and the Glider Infantry. His plan was sophisticated: a diversionary blow to fix the defenders, and then a concentrated armored thrust, painted white for the snow, to punch through the outer line and drive into the town itself, splitting the perimeter. In the small hours of December 25, the assault went in. It was the most dangerous moment of the entire siege. German tanks broke through the thin outer crust of the defense and drove toward the town, some of them getting alarmingly close to the command posts. For a few hours, the outcome hung in genuine doubt, and then the second half of the American answer revealed itself. The penetration was met by paratroopers and glider infantry, by the tank destroyers of the 705th, by the division's own tanks, and, above all, by artillery firing from inside the perimeter with devastating, concentrated effect. The German armor that had broken in was hunted through the fields and villages and destroyed, nearly to the last vehicle. By the end of Christmas Day, the best coordinated blow the Germans managed to land against Bastogne had failed, and failed expensively. The defenders held. McAuliffe had marked the day with a message to his men. He acknowledged, with dry humor, that there was not much that seemed merry about being surrounded and cold at Christmas. Then he explained to them what they had accomplished, that by holding this vital road center, they were disrupting the enemy's entire plan, and he told them to be proud of what they were doing. It was a commander's Christmas gift to a freezing, encircled garrison. Not comfort, which he could not give, but meaning. But holding, even holding through the Christmas attack, was not the same as winning. The garrison was still surrounded, still running down, still short of surgeons, and, despite the airdrops, never comfortably supplied. The equilibrium could not last forever. Something from outside would have to break it, and that something was already moving. To understand it, we have to leave Bastogne entirely and go to a schoolhouse in the French city of Verdun on December 19th, days before the ring even fully closed. Verdun. The name itself carries the weight of the previous war, the great bloodletting of 1916. Now, in a cold barracks room there, on December 19, 1944, the senior American commanders of the Western Front gathered around a table to decide how to respond to the German offensive. The Supreme Commander, General Dwight Eisenhower, opened the meeting by insisting that the situation be treated as an opportunity and not a disaster. The Germans had come out of their fortifications and exposed themselves. Now, he argued, they could be cut off and destroyed, if the Allies kept their nerve and reacted correctly. The critical question was the southern flank of the German Bulge. Could a force be turned to strike up into it, to relieve the threatened road hubs and eventually to cut the penetration off? Eisenhower looked to the commander of the Third Army, whose forces were then attacking eastward, toward the Saar region of Germany, in an entirely different direction. That commander was Lieutenant General George Patton. What Patton said next has become one of the most famous claims in American military history, and unlike many famous claims, it is well attested. Eisenhower asked how soon Patton could intervene. Patton said he could attack north with 3 divisions in a matter of days. The figure he gave was so short that some in the room reportedly greeted it with skepticism, even a ripple of disbelief. To disengage an army that is attacking hard in one direction, turn it 90 degrees, and send it attacking just as hard in a completely different direction, in winter, over icy roads, in a matter of days, ran against everything staff officers understood about how armies actually move. But Patton was not bluffing, and this is the part of the story that matters far more than the boast itself. He could make the promise because the work had already been done. In the days before the conference, sensing where events were heading, Patton had ordered his staff to prepare contingency plans for exactly this kind of turn. His planners had worked out several possible axes of attack in advance. They had prepared simple code words. When Patton telephoned his headquarters from Verdun and spoke a pre-arranged phrase, an entire prepared plan was set in motion without the need to write and distribute fresh orders under pressure. This is the thing to hold on to. The dramatic promise at Verdun was possible only because of undramatic preparation that no one filmed and few remember. Patton did not conjure a miracle of improvisation on the spot. He executed a plan his staff had already built. The genius was not in the boast. It was in the staff work behind it, in an army that had trained itself to turn a plan into movement faster than the enemy believed possible. And so the Third Army performed one of the most impressive feats of operational maneuver of the war. Units broke off their eastward attack, pulled back onto the roads, and drove north into freezing weather toward the sound of the guns. Traffic control, that most boring of military arts, became the difference between success and paralysis. Tens of thousands of vehicles moved along icy roads in the dark, and the movement did not collapse into chaos, because it had been thought through in advance. Patton himself moved among his units, urging them forward. The spearhead of the drive toward Bastogne would be the 3rd Corps, under Major General John Milliken, and at its heart was one of the finest armored formations in the American Army, the 4th Armored Division. On December 22, the same day McAuliffe was answering the Germans with a single rude word, the 4th Armored Division jumped off from the area around Ardennes to the south and began driving north toward Bastogne. The distance was not enormous, only a handful of villages and a few tens of kilometers. Patton, ever optimistic, hoped the division might cover it quickly, perhaps in a day. It took 4. And in that gap between hope and reality lies the truth about what the drive north actually was. Not a cavalry charge down an open road, a grinding, village by village, bridge by bridge fight against a determined enemy in bad country in worse weather. The 4th Armored Division advanced along multiple routes, its 3 combat commands moving in parallel, and almost immediately the same factors that had shaped everything else in this campaign shaped the relief drive too. The terrain channeled the tanks onto the roads. The roads ran through villages. The villages were held by German infantry, in this sector largely the paratroopers of the 5th Fallschirmjäger Division, stiffened by anti-tank guns and artillery. Every stream was an obstacle, and the Germans blew the bridges as they fell back. Every blown bridge meant engineers working under fire to build a new crossing before the tanks could continue. The winter days were desperately short, giving only a few hours of usable light. Snow and ice made the going treacherous, and vehicles slid off roads and through their tracks. The fighting at these villages was severe and often costly. At Chaumont, an American attack that seemed to be succeeding was thrown back by a sharp German counterattack supported by armor and aircraft, and ground that had been gained was lost again in an afternoon. At Warnach and at Bigonville, the combat commands ground through hard German resistance in fights that cost time and lives and did not always go the Americans' way on the first attempt. This was not the lightning advance of legend. It was closer to a brawl, a series of separate, bitter village battles, each one eating another portion of the short winter day. Patton, watching the slow progress with mounting frustration, confided to his diary that things looked a little tough, that the relief was proving harder than he had hoped, and that this was a hell of a Christmas. Even he, the great apostle of speed, could not simply wish the tanks through the 5th Fallschirmjäger Division. By December 26, the leading combat command, the reserve command of the 4th Armored Division, was approaching the last stretch of ground before Bastogne from the southwest. And here the drive reached its decisive moment, at a small village called Assenois. The situation was this. The tanks were close, only a few kilometers from the perimeter, but between them and the paratroopers lay Assenois and the German positions around it, and beyond that a stretch of open ground. Every hour of delay meant the Germans could further reinforce the corridor and seal it again. The commander of the Reserve Command's tank battalion, the 37th Tank Battalion, was a young lieutenant colonel named Creighton Abrams, a man who would rise decades later to command all American forces in Vietnam and to lend his name to a future generation of American tanks. Abrams looked at the situation, at his dwindling force of Shermans, at the fading light, and made a decision that was as much gamble as calculation. Rather than reduce Assenois methodically, which would take time he did not have, he would gamble on a sudden dash straight through the village to the paratroopers beyond, before the Germans could react. He chose the lead element. A small team of Sherman tanks and armored infantry in half-tracks would charge up the road, through Assenois, and drive for the American lines. To cover them, Abrams called for a heavy concentration of artillery fire to fall on Assenois itself, to stun the defenders in the crucial minutes of the dash. In the lead tank was First Lieutenant Charles Boggis. Close behind, coordinating the assault, came Captain William Dwight. The dash was violent and confused, as such things always are. The artillery hammered Assenois. The tanks charged into and through the village while the shell fire was still lifting, so close behind their own barrage that there was danger from their own guns. There was point-blank fighting in the streets. The column became briefly separated in the smoke and chaos, with the infantry half-tracks caught in a vicious close-quarters fight in the village, while the lead tanks pressed on ahead. German infantry emerged from cover and had to be fought off, and part of the road had to be cleared of mines under fire. But the lead tanks broke clear of the far side of Assenois and out into the open ground beyond, driving hard for the perimeter. And then, at around 10 minutes to 5 in the afternoon, on December 26, 1944, Lieutenant Boggis in the lead, Sherman saw foxholes ahead, and figures in them, and engineers of the Airborne Division who had been holding the southwestern edge of the perimeter. He called out to them. Cautious at first, the paratroopers held their positions, uncertain whether the approaching tanks were friend or trap. Then an officer of the Airborne Engineers came forward and made contact with the tankers. A corridor into Bastogne, narrow, fragile but real, had been opened from the outside for the first time in days. Now return to that meeting in the snow, the image we started with, and see it for what it actually was. It was not the arrival of a rescuing army sweeping the enemy aside. It was the thin leading edge of a single tank battalion's desperate gamble, punching a slender gap through a village at dusk. Behind Boggis's tank, there was not a flood of relieving force, but a tenuous thread, a corridor so narrow and so contested that it could be, and was, fired on from both sides for days afterward. The Germans had not been driven off. They had merely been, for a moment, pierced. This is why the men inside rejected the word rescue. From where they stood, nothing fundamental had changed on December 26. They had been holding the town before the tanks arrived, and they went on holding it and fighting hard, long after. The link-up was militarily vital. It opened a route by which wounded could at last be evacuated and reinforcements and supply could come in by ground. But it was not a curtain falling on the drama. In many ways, the most intense fighting around Bastogne came after the corridor opened, in the last days of December and the first weeks of January, as the Germans threw fresh divisions into furious attempts to cut the slender neck of the salient, and the Americans fought to widen it and to push outward. Men who had survived the siege itself were killed in the battles to keep the corridor open. To the paratroopers, the idea that they had been saved on December 26, when for many of them the worst fighting still lay ahead, was not just wrong. It was an insult to what they had endured and would still endure. For the relief was not the end of the battle. It was the hinge of it. Through late December and into January, the front around Bastogne remained one of the most violent sectors on the Western Front. The Germans, now under direct pressure to eliminate the town before their entire attack collapsed, launched renewed assaults in the first days of January, throwing in additional divisions in a last effort to overwhelm the defense and sever the corridor. They failed, but the failure was paid for on both sides, in heavy casualties across the frozen fields and shattered woods that ringed the town. Only in mid-January, after weeks of continuous fighting, did the situation finally resolve. The Third Army pushing up from the south and the First Army pressing down from the north gradually squeezed the German salient from both sides, and around January 16, 1945, their spearheads met near the town of Houffalize, to the north of Bastogne, pinching off the tip of the Bulge. Only then, roughly a month after they had first been trucked into the town, were the exhausted paratroopers of the 101st finally pulled out of the line. The cost had been severe. The Airborne Division and its attachments suffered thousands of casualties in the defense of the town. The 4th Armored Division paid heavily in the relief drive, and these were only a fraction of the enormous losses of the wider Battle of the Bulge, which stands among the costliest battles the American Army ever fought. So we come back to the question we started with, and now we can answer it properly. Why did the ring around Bastogne break? And the answer is that it did not break the way the story implies, in a single heroic stroke. It was pried open, briefly, by one battalion's gamble, at the end of a 4-day grind, because the Germans holding that stretch of the ring were too thin, too short of fuel, too pulled apart by competing priorities, and too battered from the air to hold it shut. And then it was kept open, and finally widened, only through weeks more of hard fighting. But underneath even that, there is a deeper answer, and it is the same answer to a different question. Why could the Germans never take the town in the first place? And the two questions turn out to be the same questions seen from opposite sides. The Germans could not take Bastogne because taking a place requires concentration, and everything about their situation forbade it. They needed the roads, and could not use their best divisions on them, because the town blocked the hub. They needed fuel and did not have it. They needed to mass against one point, and instead attacked in fragments from all around a wide circle. They needed the sky to stay closed, and instead it opened, exposing every attempt to gather their strength to attack from the air. Their doctrine of aggressive, independent, fast-moving action, the doctrine that had won them the opening days, was the wrong tool for the slow, methodical, overwhelming push that reducing a fortified hub demanded. After the war, their own commanders would acknowledge as much, that the failure to take Bastogne quickly had helped wreck the timetable on which the entire offensive depended. The Americans, for their part, held and then relieved the town less through individual heroism, though there was a great deal of that, than through advantages that were structural rather than personal, interior lines that let a smaller force shift to meet each threat in turn, artillery, and a system for coordinating it, refined over years, that could concentrate the fire of many batteries on one point faster than the enemy could concentrate an attack, which is why the Christmas assault died in the fields under massed shell fire. Air power waiting on the weather, and a machine that could rain supply, and even surgeons, into a surrounded garrison from the sky, and a Third Army staff culture that could turn an army 90 degrees in days because it had done the dull planning in advance. Notice what those advantages share. Not one of them turns on a single soldier being braver or a single commander more brilliant than his German counterpart. Each is about a system. The German army bet on the brilliance of its parts, on the man on the spot, and the quality of the individual unit. It was a good bet, and in many battles it paid. The American army bet on the design of the whole. At Bastogne, in the snow and the fuel starvation and the geometry of 7 roads, the second bet beat the first. That is the lesson buried inside the famous story. We remember a word of defiance and a tank in the snow, because defiance and rescue make a clean and stirring tale. But the town did not hold because of a word, and it was not saved by a single tank. The paratrooper in his foxhole on December 26, watching a Sherman roll up out of the smoke, did not feel rescued, and he was right not to. He had been part of the reason the ring could never close. The tank was not his salvation. It was confirmation of something he and the tanker had proven together, that a war is not always won by the side that is braver or faster in the single moment of contact. Sometimes it is won, quietly and without spectacle, by the side that built the better machine long before the shooting started, and then refused to let the other side make it a fair fight. The snow melted that spring, the corridor became a highway, and then a memory. The Bulge was pushed back, and by late January the front stood roughly where it had been before December 16, and the German army had spent, in the attempt, the last great reserves it would ever field in the West. What was left of the divisions that had ringed Bastogne would be swept up in the months that followed, driven back across the Rhine, into a Germany with no more fuel to run dry, and no more roads left to fight for. Bastogne endured as the symbol, and it deserves to. But if we are honest about what happened there, the truest emblem of the battle is not the word of defiance or the meeting in the snow, satisfying as both are. It is the empty road behind the tank, the fuel that was not there. The plan prepared before anyone knew it would be needed. The men of Bastogne lived inside that hard truth for the better part of a month in the cold. Most of them never called it a rescue. They knew better. They had been there, and they understood exactly what had held. If this account gave you a new way to see a battle you thought you knew, consider leaving a like and subscribing. It is how these deeper histories, The ones standing just behind the famous images find the people who want to understand them.